How's it going? I'm Mike from Australia, and this is the English Breakthrough for Germans podcast, or as one of my students accidentally called it this week, English Breakfast for Germans. Yeah, in this podcast, I want to help German speakers who feel stuck with their English to give you an alternative to learning apps, Volkshochschule courses, and if you feel that your school English wasn't enough, by talking about effective independent learning strategies. A lot of my students tell me that they're not good at learning languages, and I don't believe that anybody is really bad at learning languages. Maybe they just haven't learned the right strategies yet. I tell anecdotes in this podcast about my own learning and teaching experiences to create relatable aha moments so you know how to use your time more effectively when you're learning English. I'm an English and German language teacher, a keen language learner myself, and I'm also a musician. And I composed and played the music you're hearing right now. Mir fallen die Worte nicht ein. Das sagen viele meiner Kursteilnehmer. Wenn du das auch manchmal zu deinem Englisch sagst, dann bist du hier genau richtig. Und ein bilinguales Transkript dieses Podcasts ist jetzt auf meinem Patreon kostenlos erhältlich. Du findest einen Link dazu in der Episodenbeschreibung. Alright, let's get started. I just spent over an hour getting my hands dirty trying to fix my bike. Oh my god, it is so frustrating. I actually knew I needed to get new brake pads. The brake pads are the parts of the brakes which touch the wheels to slow down the wheels. I knew I needed to replace them, and I bought 2 new pairs of brake pads. And normally I can fix problems on my bikes. And the brake pads, to be honest, I don't think was the problem. I took the back wheel off, and then there's a problem with the gears in the back. I have this like internal gear system on my back wheel, and I love my bike and I cycle everywhere. I use it all the time, but I couldn't get it fixed. I had to make an appointment at the bike shop. So I'm going to take my bike there next Monday, which is frustrating because it means that I won't have my bike for 1 whole week, which is very difficult in Berlin in summer. Anyway, enough about my bike. Yeah, I'm going to tell you about a learning experience of mine again, this time learning German. So back when I was learning German in 2011, I was incorrectly put into a B2 course. I had done 1 year of lessons in Sydney, and then when I arrived in Berlin, I went to the Deutsche Academy at Wittenbergplatz, and they gave me a placement test to do at the computer there. I then went to a lady at the reception to speak about my result and to work out what the next steps were in finding a class for me. And she said that she needed to speak to me a little bit in German so she could test my speaking ability. I remember she asked me, wenn du viel Geld hättest, was würdest du tun? And I thought, oh, fantastic. She's testing me on the Konjunktiv 2. The conditional sentences. I know this. I had just studied it actually. So I said, wenn ich viel Geld hätte, würde ich ein großes Haus haben. Oder wenn ich ein König wäre, hätte ich ein großes Schloss. The one about the castle, I think, was the exact example from the course book that I'd used to study with. She raised her eyebrows and she looked at me like she was very impressed. She told me that my writing level was very good. She told me that my writing level wasn't very good, but that my speaking level was very high. And she put me into a B2 class. I thought, what? B2? I had managed to get through A1, A2, and B1 in just 1 year of classes, 2 hours a week. It didn't seem right. Sure enough, when I got to the class, it was really hard. There was so much vocabulary that I didn't know. I remember we learned about Goethe and Hundertwasser and architecture, and there was just so much that I didn't understand. I thought to myself, oh God, there's so much more I need to learn. And I didn't feel good being in that class. From that point on, anytime a word came up in class, which I didn't know, I wrote it in my vocabulary book. I wrote down every single word, which filled up my vocabulary book really fast, and each night I went home and I transferred the vocabulary to the digital flashcards on my computer. Flashcards are Karteikarten. I had a program for testing myself with English and German. So it was really overwhelming for me and it became really difficult. Early in that class, there was so much that I couldn't follow, and it was really frustrating me. I didn't feel good about myself. There were other people in the class who could speak so naturally, so I thought, but for me it was just really, really hard. I spent a lot of time just listening, trying to follow the class discussions and answering questions in very basic sentences. So what happened? Well, I was put into a class based on my grammatical ability, but my vocabulary size wasn't tested. My level was only really determined by my grammar. The grammar of these spoken sentences that I said. But this doesn't really make a lot of sense. Because, well, imagine for a moment, you've just met somebody new and you're a German speaker, and this person that you met, maybe at work or through a friend, doesn't speak German very well. They make some grammatical mistakes. What is important about this non-native speaker? What will make you feel like you can connect to that person? Is it perfect grammar? No, it's not. What's really important is if they are friendly, if they are able to communicate their ideas without too much difficulty, if they're a nice person. So we know that these things are important to us. So why do we focus so much on grammar? We know intuitively that grammar is not the most important thing, but this still has some kind of a holy status, which is not really valid. Perhaps it's because grammar is a relatively easy thing to measure, to test. What often gets forgotten and neglected is vocabulary. So when most people think about the levels of language learning like A1, A2, B1, etc., they usually think about grammatical competence. And they forget about vocabulary. Or maybe they think about things you can do, like you can talk about your work, you can talk about your family, where you come from, where you live, etc. But the range of vocabulary is not something that people think about. But did you know there are also vocabulary lists and sizes of vocabulary which are associated to the CEFR levels, which are the Common European Framework Reference for Languages, so B1, A1, etc. In fact, you can go and do a test of your vocabulary and you can get an idea of exactly what level your vocabulary is. Or you can download the Oxford 3000 and Oxford 5000 vocabulary lists and you can get an idea of the levels of different words on those lists. You can just Google them, Oxford 3000 vocabulary or Oxford 5000. So a reason why vocabulary is often neglected is because it's not possible for course books to contain the amount of vocabulary with the repetition that you need to learn the 3000 words up to B2 on the Oxford 3000 list. For you to be able to learn this vocabulary and have the repetition, there would have to be lots of long stories or long videos in your course book, and this is not really suitable for a language classroom where students are usually there to learn how to speak and they want to practice speaking. So I've often said to my students, if you have a good vocabulary size with poor grammar, then you can still communicate. But if you have excellent grammar and poor vocabulary, then it's difficult to communicate. All right, so good vocabulary, poor grammar, you can communicate. Good grammar, poor vocabulary, you can't communicate very well. So most people do intuitively know that vocabulary is more important than learning grammar, but still people like focusing on grammar because it gives us a sense of achieving in a lot smaller time. To learn 3,000 words obviously takes a long time. So if I spend a week doing these B1 grammar exercises, then my level will be B1, right? Well, unfortunately, that doesn't really account for your vocabulary size. So that's what I would like to talk to you about in this episode of the podcast, vocabulary. So I mentioned to you last week that I've been reading a book about vocabulary, and I want to share some key insights from that book with you about how to learn vocabulary. So firstly, what is that book? Well, that book is called Teaching Extensive Reading in Another Language by Paul Nation and Rob Waring. But don't worry about that, that's not so important. But I will tell you that Paul Nation really is one of the most experienced and respected people in English language teaching. So I like him, and he really does have a lot of people do look up to him and the things that he publishes. And it's not just because he's from Australia's closest neighbour, New Zealand, that I think he's important. Though, of course, that is kind of cool. All right, so there are a few concepts that are very important about vocabulary that I would like to clarify with you. So 3 points here. So one of the points I've already mentioned, repetition. So for vocabulary learning, you need to have repetition. You need to see the words multiple times and understand them in the context if you're going to have a chance of learning those words. A word which you see only once is likely to be forgotten quickly if you do not meet it again. So repetition is really important for how the brain learns. Okay, point number 2. Frequency is important. Frequency. Frequency is how often a word happens in that language. So it is a higher priority for us to learn the words which have a higher frequency in the language. So I'm going to test you a little bit here in your feeling, your intuition for word frequency with some German words, okay? So which words from these ones are more frequent in German? Machen, spähen, like spähte zu ihr hinüber. Sich interessieren or versagen. Or which of these two phrases are more frequent? Das ist lange her. Or, das lässt sich nicht pauschal beantworten. Okay, so I think it should be clear to you as German speakers that the first words and phrases are more frequent. So machen is more frequent than spähen, sich interessieren is more frequent than versagen, das ist lange her is more frequent than das lässt sich nicht pauschal beantworten. So it does feel more intuitive to you as a native speaker to say, yes, learners should absolutely learn machen before they learn spähen. But it can be much more difficult for a learner to recognize which words are more frequent and therefore have a higher priority for learning. If you find a new word in a book, how are you supposed to know if it's a frequent word or not? You have no real way to tell. So as learners, we need some kind of guidance. And it also makes sense that you should learn the top 500 words first, and then the top 1,000 words, and then the top 2,000 words. Yeah, so if a word in English is only in the top 9,000 words, then that's quite a low priority, so you shouldn't worry about that too early. So this concept is called word frequency. This tells us how frequently does this word appear in the language. So I mentioned to you already, there is this Oxford 3000 vocabulary list. So you can really just Google this, just type in Oxford 3000 and you'll find the 3000 most frequent words in English according to Oxford. In the A1 level, there are 900 words. In the A2 level, there are 1,900 words. B1, 2,600, and then the top 3,000 words takes us into B2. But actually, I'll put this on my Patreon page for you. So if you click on the link in the podcast description, you can go to my Patreon and download the list there. Okay, so the first point was repetition. The second point was frequency. The third point now is context. Okay, so vocabulary needs to be learned in context so the brain has an opportunity to connect that language to some kind of reality or narrative which you can relate to. Okay, so I will never forget the German phrase, mit ihr ist nicht gut Kirschen essen, because that was about a character from Harry Potter. It was Professor McGonagall, who is conservative and quite cold. So this phrase is really represented by her. She represents the meaning of that phrase for me in my mind. So when we learn the context, this means that we can also experience the kind of language that the phrases or the vocabulary also go with. Okay, so just think about that for a moment. If you have a coffee, for example, you need to know what adjectives you can use to describe that coffee. You can say a strong coffee, but you can't say a powerful coffee. Okay, for a computer, you could say a powerful computer, but you couldn't say a strong computer. So we also learn the other words that go with the words when we experience them in context. And the other thing is that you use different vocabulary in different situations. So you speak differently to a police officer and to a child, right? At work, you might use different vocabulary compared to how you speak at home or with your friends. So when we meet vocabulary in context, such as when we read books or watch TV series, our brain gets extra information, extra pragmatic information about a word, such as, is it formal or informal? Is it used by young people, by old people? And what kind of situations it's used in. So this information is really impossible to get a feeling for through decontextualized examples, such as those in learning apps like the monkey drinks the milk, which was a sentence that I had on Duolingo one time. So you must learn vocabulary in context. All right, so those are the three things: repetition, frequency, and context. So how do we get lots of repetitions of words which are the right frequency for the stage of learning which we are at? Well, you might have guessed already that my answer to this is that you need to read books. Series, watching TV shows, of course, too. But books are a fantastic way to do it, and possibly the best way. So you need to read books so you can get the necessary repetition of vocabulary, and then you can learn vocabulary in context as well. You might think, well, that's easy. I'll just go into an English bookshop and I'll buy a book for a native speaker. But there's a problem here. The problem is that if you take regular books which are written for native speakers, then you are getting words which are not the right frequency for you, and you can't tell which words are more important than other words if you find a new word. So for example, I learnt the German word prächtig in Harry Potter, but I haven't really heard that word very often since. So that's not a very frequent word. I'm happy that I learned it, but perhaps there were better words for me to learn at that time. In order to read a book that was written for native speakers, you need a vocabulary size of at least 5,000 words. Preferably up to 9,000 words if you want to cover 98% of the vocabulary. So if you're a strong B1 user of English with a vocabulary of 3,000 words, like on the Oxford 3000 list, you probably only have half of the vocabulary that you need to be able to read a book which is written for a native speaker. Okay, well, you can read it, of course, but as I said, you will find unknown words. So if you don't have a lot of vocabulary, you will find a lot of unknown words. And if there are more than a couple of unknown words on the page, it's going to be hard for you to read at a speed which native speakers would read at. So you don't really have an authentic reading experience. An authentic reading experience is when you can read a book at a normal reading rate. So you meet a lot of vocabulary that you know and understand, which means that you are reinforcing, you are strengthening everything that you know about that vocabulary. And the grammatical structures are at your level or maybe just a little ahead, so you are comfortably able to follow the narrative of the story. So we want to be reading material that enables us to read at the same speed as our regular reading rate. Okay, so how do we get an authentic reading experience? The answer is that we need books which are controlled for our level, so we can develop our reading fluency without being challenged by long sentences and vocabulary which is past our level. So this way we can develop our reading fluency by reading at the same rate as a native speaker does in his or her first language. Books which contain controlled vocabulary and grammar are known as graded readers. The German word is Lektüren. So eine englische Lektüre, for example. So graded readers. The word graded means eingestuft, something like that. So the graded readers are from publishers like Cambridge, Oxford, or Penguin, and they start at level 1, or even start at below level 1, and they go up to level 6 or level 7. So one advantage of these books is that because of the controlled vocabulary, there are no words which are not worth learning. So you know that you can learn every word from the book and you will see the words again and again soon, so you will get the repetition of those words. So in a graded reader, they would replace a word like spähen with a word like schauen, because clearly schauen is more frequent than spähen. But of course, a learner might not realize that. Another advantage is that graded readers are novels, Romane. Okay, they're novels. So novels contain language which is more similar to spoken language than informative text like news or academic articles. So if you imagine reading Der Spiegel, you'll notice that there's not a lot of spoken style language in Der Spiegel. It's a very different genre. So it's important to be reading vocabulary which is more spoken in nature. But what level do you think you should read? Well, you should ideally have only a maximum of 2 to 3 unknown words on each page, because this way you're able to guess from the context if you don't know the word, and you can read at a normal reading rate or reading speed. If you're reading at a higher level, you might meet a lot of unknown words and your reading will be slowed down when you meet a strange sentence structure or an unknown word. So this takes away from your reading speed. So actually, to begin with, I would recommend reading a book 2 levels below where you think you are. If you think you're at about B1, then start with an A1 book. If you think you are B2, then read an A2 book. You might think, well, Mike, that might be boring or too easy for me. And yes, maybe it will be too easy for you, but that means that you'll be able to read the book really, really fast, which is also really satisfying. So, in fact, I would recommend anybody to read an A1 book, even if your level is C1, because then you can learn exactly what kind of vocabulary is considered high frequency vocabulary, and you can get a good feeling for the most common grammatical structures and words. So you can develop your intuition for important pieces of language. Many of my German-speaking English learners, even at B1 or B2 level, haven't mastered high frequency vocabulary. Things like used to. So in a sentence like, I used to work with children. Or I was going to, for talking about past alternative intentions. For example, I was going to send you that email, but then my mum called. So we chatted for an hour and I was distracted. Yeah, I was going to send you that email. This signals a past alternative intention. So this is because they haven't noticed how common these structures are. So these sorts of phrases, for used to, for example, a German speaker might say, or in former times, or in the last years, or something like that. But used to is really a much more natural way to say something that you did in the past. You know, like, I used to play guitar, but then I stopped and started playing piano. Or I used to play football, but then I injured myself, so I stopped playing football. So when you see structures like this again and again, you can develop your intuition for them, as I said. And graded readers these days only cost about €10. So it's quite easy to buy a few graded readers at low levels, and then you can read them quickly and then move up the levels fast. And in my opinion, the best graded readers are from the publisher Penguin, so the Penguin readers, but Cambridge also has some great readers as well. So Cambridge readers, and then level 3, level 4, etc. But the Cambridge ones are a little bit older. And of course, it's important to focus on the sound of the language. So I do like to mention that. So the Cambridge ones and the Penguin readers both have audio available for you to download. So you can listen to the audio and read at the same time. Again, your level is the level where there are a maximum of 2 or 3 unfamiliar words on each page. So if you buy a level 5 book and there are too many or there are more unknown words than that, then maybe you should try level 4. And how much reading should you do? Well, the recommendation is that you read about 1 book per week. So this might sound like a lot, but most graded readers are only about 70 to 100 pages long. So this actually only means about 10 minutes of reading a day or 60 minutes of reading a week. So that's not that much. And this way, you're meeting the words frequently enough to get the repetition that you need for them to enter your long-term memory. And once you've moved up through the levels and you can read books at C2 level comfortably, then you should easily be able to move to regular books with uncontrolled vocabulary, which have been written for native speaker readers. Okay, I'm coming to the end of the podcast now. I'm going to summarize some of the key concepts here. So in terms of vocabulary, repetition. Our brain needs repetition to learn. Word frequency. We need to prioritize the most frequent words first. Context. Context is a must. Don't learn words in isolation because you don't have that extra contextual information. If you want, you can put new words on flashcards. Flashcards are Karteikarten, and there's great free software which you can use to do that. But my recommendation with flashcards is only use words which you have found in context. Because every time you practice that word then, you will remember the context that you learnt it in. So for example, spielen I got from Harry Potter as well. I remember, spielte zu ihr hinüber or something like that. So every time I see or hear that word, it makes me have some kind of a connection to the meaning of the word. And this context will be activated every time that you see the word. Okay, so some concepts now regarding reading and graded readers. So again, read 1 book per week. This is the goal. For a 100-page book, that's about 10 minutes a day or 1 hour a week. So that's not so bad. And choose a level which will be comfortable for you and then move up until you find one with a maximum of 2 to 3 unknown words on each page. Then you can read 4 to 5 books at that level and move up when you're ready to the next level. It's best to stay at that same level for a while so you can keep it easy and enjoyable rather than moving up too early to a level that is too high for you where you have too many unknown words. So again, I recommend the Penguin Readers or the Cambridge Readers, and you can easily find them on Google. You can buy them on Thalia. I think Dussmann should have some of them as well, and Amazon too. All right, that's it for now. I really hope you've enjoyed this podcast. Maybe you could send me a message on my Patreon to let me know if there was something that was very useful for you. And again, you can find a transcript of the podcast on my Patreon too. And a link to that is in the description of this podcast episode. Okay, that's it. Great. Thanks very much, everybody. See you or hear you next time. Maybe I will, maybe I won't. Anyway, it's been great to have you listen until the end. Have a fantastic evening. Bye-bye.